And he's ready for agreements which will take us forward. I am personally ready for the dialogue. I want the opposition of Venezuela to get out of the trap in which it was put.
So, are you accompanying us this Saturday and Sunday, brothers, to prepare the major demonstration of next week? Of course, we're going back to the streets.
Illegitimate, corrupt, incompetent. That's how the US is calling Maduro's regime as the standoff continues to escalate in the Venezuelan capital. We spoke to former US Congressman Ron Paul, who feels it's ironic. Washington claims it's fighting for democracy there, but implementing authoritarian methods.
I think it's going to end up in violence and could have a civil war. Some countries are lining up with him, but we've been antagonizing and threatening him and decide that we're going to install a president for them. And I would think even the people that might not like Maduro shouldn't like us settling the dispute. It's internal. They should settle it. And I think it's rather ironic for our government to say that they want to take care of Venezuela because they're not democratic, and we have to take care of it by, authoritarian approach of us installing a president and having a coup and threaten them with military violence because they're not democratic enough. I would hardly say that our position is very democratic. What we have to do, if somebody wonders what could happen, is they ought to look at U.S. foreign policy the past 10 years or so. More recently, and what's happened in Syria, what has happened earlier on with Iraq and Afghanistan, and Libya. I mean, every time we go in and say, well, you need help, you need to be Americanized, you need to know our good values, and we want you to learn what democracy is all about, and we'll give you a little money, too, if you obey us. It's always that little tease. But it just violates completely and totally the position that I hold and the Ron Paul Institute holds, and that is nonviolence or not getting involved, non-interventionism. It's not our business. I'm sure there's some harm done by Maduro and others, but where is it our job? Where do we get the moral authority to be the decider and say, you are worse than the other side, and that's why we're going to do it?
With violent protests still hitting Venezuela, it's not the first time that Washington's been accused of interfering in other countries' affairs and causing instability. Ran Gezdiev looks at whether events in Venezuela are following a tried and tested formula.
Starting an uprising, a revolution, is simple enough. First comes the pressure. Sanctions built up gradually. First, it was a few officials, then they sanctioned the president and state companies and the government itself. Through deed and word, they helped choke Venezuela into a crisis.
We are evaluating all of our policy options as to what can we do to create a change of conditions where either Maduro decides he doesn't have a future, or we can return the government processes back to their constitution.
We are not going to tolerate the dictatorship he's trying to create.
The Venezuelan people deserve better than what the regime of Nicolas Maduro offers them.
Now that the country and people are in economic misery and you've vilified its leaders, pick a hero, like 35-year-old US-educated head of the National Assembly, which, as it turns out, the United States has been quietly assisting financially and helping for a while. Who would have thought? By now, you should have caused enough trouble, problems on top of everything else to force even the apolitical into the streets. The more noise, the better. And you mustn't let things calm down. Keep shouting, keep agitating.
I'm going to be loud, President Trump's going to be loud, the United States is going to be loud, and Maduro will hear us because we won't stop talking until we see Maduro go. Keep your voices loud. We love you, we thank you, and we won't give up the fight. God bless you.
In the anarchy, the chaos, the confusion, comes a special moment when law breaks down, when loyalties crumble, when brother turns on brother in the street, partly thanks to you. At that moment, do something crazy, like denounce the government, proclaim a new unelected president.
Hola, I'm Mike Pence, the Vice President of the United States. The United States supports the courageous decision by Juan Guaido, the President of your National Assembly, to assert that body's constitutional powers, declare Maduro a usurper, and call for the establishment of a transitional government.
Now is the time for more direct action. Get all your friends on board, as many nations to recognize Juan Guaido as president as quickly as possible. There's no going back now.
Colombia recognizes Juan Guaido as president of Venezuela and will assist in the transition to democracy to liberate the Venezuelan people from the dictator.
Brazil has just issued a note recognizing Juan Guaido as Venezuela's president.
We will support this transition into democracy alongside all the countries in the Lima Group.
We recognize and express our full support for the interim presidency of Venezuela assumed by the President of the National Assembly, Juan Guaido.
It is clear that Nicolas Maduro is not the legitimate leader of Venezuela. So the United Kingdom believes that Juan Guaido is the right person to take Venezuela forward.
There's heavy pressure from the U.S. Certainly all of the allies, countries like Honduras that are allied with the United States are going to be expected to parrot this line. If you go back to 1973, in the attempt to overthrow Salvador Allende, it was exactly the same playbook. We're watching a replay. These are the kinds of tactics that the American government has used to overthrow regimes that it considers hostile to U.S. business interests. Certainly smaller countries will feel the pressure, especially within Latin America, from the United States to play the game.
You see, if your country just so happens to be in the Americas, you're in Washington's hemisphere, which it seems justifies meddling, interfering and changing governments at will. But just to be sure, bully them. Let them know that if you don't get what you want, you'll beat the lights out of them and take what you want.
Are you considering a military option for Venezuela?
We're not considering anything, but all options are on the table.
Does that mean you're considering those?
We're just, all options, always, all options are on the table.
And there you go, sparking Uprisings 101. Now, this may all take some practice, a tweak here or there, but it works. Tried and tested time and time again. But the consequences are a whole other story.
OK, let's bring in independent journalist Martin Summers now. Good evening to you, Martin. Seems like the world's kind of splitting now, parting down the middle between those who support Maduro and those who want to see him replaced. But importantly, he still seems to have the backing of the military. Is it going to be possible to move him or not?
Well, obviously, having the backing of the military is pretty key. And, of course, his predecessor, Chavez, was a lieutenant colonel in the paratroops. And often in Latin America in the past, the military have been the weakest link and have moved against democratic governments that the US didn't like. But in this case, because there was an attempted coup in 2002, a lot of the dead wood, if you like, were removed from the military, and what is left is relatively solid for the Maduro regime, if we can call it that. And of course, there was an attempted assassination attempt in August on Maduro with drones, and of course the government there blamed that on the opposition and their US allies. And we're talking about the world splitting. I think it's very significant, for example, that Erdogan in Turkey has supported Maduro, even though he's a part of NATO, because, of course, the US tried to remove him some years ago now and failed. And I think that this is probably how this is going to play out here. The Erdogan's still there. Lots of people were killed in the attempted coup, but he remains. And because of what's happened to him, he's lining up with Maduro, even though he's a key NATO ally. So it's not actually going to be plain sailing for these people who are trying to push this. The military's against them, at least half the population are against them, and key allies like Turkey are against them, and Mexico, of course, are sitting on the fence because Obrador's just come to power there. He's a left-wing politician of long standing. And if you go for splitting the world, then you may find that you've actually split the world, but you haven't split it in the way you intended.
Why are so many countries queuing up to condemn Maduro and want him replaced? Surely this isn't really about the accusation that there wasn't a free and fair election there.
Well, you've got basically. I was in Colombia in 2005 on a delegation, and it's a very divided society there. Latin American countries are very divided between a small elite, which has always dominated the politics of the country, and a majority which has been shut out. and there's been a period of reformism across the region, gradually running into the sands as a result of things like the collapse in the oil price, which has really undermined the Venezuelan economy. And of course the other thing is the sanctions have been on Venezuela for years, for all sorts of specious reasons, and that leads to a situation where there's genuine distress for the ordinary folk. And that's as was suggested in your report, that's the playbook. That's what happened in Chile in 1973. They said we've got to make the economy scream. There were strikes by truckers, all sorts of pots and pans demonstrations by middle-class people opposed to the Allende regime. This is actually, we've been here before. But I think the Venezuelan regime is not going to be easily removed. And if there was, for example, a military intervention from Colombia, Brazil, backed up by the US, the Venezuelan army will resist. And a lot of people will be killed, a bit like Syria. And I think, the Syrian regime have already, Assad has already expressed his support for Maduro, but I think what most significant is the support from Mexico and from Turkey. And I think that probably surprised the people who are trying to push this.
Just to mention the elections again, though, Germany, for example, has said that it will recognise Guaido as president if a fair and legitimate election isn't held. So they're using this reason. Is it just an excuse? People didn't bother too much about Robert Mugabe, and there are countless examples you can give. They're cherry-picking Venezuela, but why?
Well, it's got massive oil reserves.